Order?
You want order? There is no order in your courtroom. You are a disgrace to that bench, and everyone knows it.
There are moments in a courtroom that stop time. Not because a verdict is read, not because someone breaks down in tears, but because a person walks in and immediately makes you wonder how they ever got this far without someone simply saying, no. This is one of those moments. And there is something buried in the officer's report from that day, a detail that Madison Pierce clearly never expected anyone to read aloud in open court. I am Frederick and I cover courtroom stories that remind us why accountability still matters. Hit that like button if you're already curious where this one ends up. Madison Pierce was 23 years old the morning she walked into Providence Municipal Court. She was the only daughter of real estate developer Richard Pierce, a man with significant money, expensive lawyers on speed dial, and apparently a very long history of making his daughter's problems disappear before they ever fully formed into consequences. Madison walked through those heavy courtroom doors with designer sunglasses still sitting on top of her perfectly styled blonde hair, her phone glowing in her hand, and the kind of easy, practiced confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never truly facing anything. She didn't glance at the judge. She didn't acknowledge the bailiff. She didn't register the dozen citizens sitting in the gallery who were already watching her entrance with expressions ranging from quiet curiosity to immediate disapproval. She walked toward the defendant's podium, still scrolling through Instagram, moving with the casual energy of someone who believed the next 10 minutes would be a minor inconvenience before she returned to her actual life. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined as she strolled across that marble floor, was that Judge Frank Caprio had spent the previous evening reviewing every detail of her case. Not just the incident report, her full record, her history, and something else entirely, which we'll get to in a moment. She was there for reckless driving, 80 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour residential zone. That alone is a serious charge, but what elevated this from a routine bad decision into something that would define the next several hours of Madison's life was buried deeper in the officer's notes. While travelling at nearly double the posted speed limit through a neighbourhood, her vehicle had passed within 3 feet of a 9-year-old boy riding his bicycle home from school. 3 feet. That is not a near miss in the abstract sense. That is a child who went home that afternoon only because physics happened to cooperate. When the officer informed her of this after pulling her over, Madison's response was not horror or relief or even basic acknowledgement that something serious had almost occurred. She told him the child should have been on the sidewalk. She said she couldn't be expected to drive 35 miles per hour just because parents in the neighbourhood couldn't control their kids. She then told him who her father was, mentioned that they had lawyers on retainer, and noted that this conversation was wasting her time because she had a photo shoot to attend. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment, not moving past quickly. A child was nearly killed, and her first instinct was to talk about her schedule. Judge Caprio had also received calls from 2 previous judges before that morning. Both reached out to warn him personally about Madison's pattern of behaviour in court settings and her father's pattern of legal manoeuvring afterward. Madison had accumulated 7 prior traffic violations in the span of 2 years. 7, and every single one had been quietly resolved without lasting consequence. The tickets disappeared, the points disappeared, the lessons that were supposed to follow never came, because the situation never got uncomfortable enough or real enough to teach them. So when Madison walked through those courtroom doors that Tuesday morning, she was not walking into a new experience. She was walking into what she assumed would be the 8th version of the same old story. Minor inconvenience, a little waiting around. Then her father's people handle it and life resumes as normal. What she didn't know was that Judge Caprio had a folder on his bench that contained more than just a traffic report. When the bailiff called her forward, she finished typing her message before moving. She approached the podium at her own pace, her Louis Vuitton bag swinging from her shoulder, her posture radiating boredom rather than concern. Her phone remained in her hand. Judge Caprio greeted her calmly and asked her to remove her sunglasses completely and put her phone away. He described the room as a courtroom, not a coffee shop. The words were measured and polite, but anyone who had spent time in that room and watched him work over the years would have noticed the particular firmness underneath them, the tone of someone who was extending courtesy while also meaning exactly what they said. Madison's response to this simple, entirely reasonable request was to slide her sunglasses from the top of her head down to the bridge of her nose, then back up again, technically moving them, not actually complying. She set her phone on the podium in front of her, face up, where she could still see every notification come through. Then she said, in a tone that suggested she was doing everyone a favour by being present at all, "Can we make this quick? I have a lunch reservation at noon." The gallery reacted quietly but immediately. Murmurs ran through the rows. An elderly woman in the second row leaned toward her companion and shook her head. A man in a work uniform crossed his arms and settled back in his seat with the expression of someone who had suspected this was coming and was now prepared to watch it unfold completely. Judge Caprio repeated his request, firmer this time. He asked her to remove the sunglasses entirely and give the hearing her full attention, noting calmly that it had his. She grabbed the sunglasses with unnecessary force, dropped them into her bag with a gesture that somehow managed to convey compliance and contempt at the same time, executed an eye roll visible to people in the back row and said, "Fine, let's just do this." The phone remained on the podium, still face up, still lighting up with notifications. He opened her file slowly and began walking through the charges. Reckless driving, 80 miles per hour in a 35 zone, expired registration. And then the officer's notation about the 9-year-old boy on the bicycle. He gave her space to respond. She said the kid wasn't even close to her car. She said everyone speeds on that street and the limit should honestly be higher anyway. She said she had been late for a photo shoot. I want to be fair here because I think fairness matters, even when someone isn't making it easy. There are moments where people say something defensive in a stressful situation that doesn't reflect who they actually are. They're scared, they're caught off guard, they reach for something that sounds like an excuse because they haven't had time to process the situation properly. That's understandable. That's human. But what was happening in that courtroom wasn't that. Madison wasn't scared. She wasn't caught off guard. She was irritated, and the things she said reflected exactly how she had thought about this situation since the moment it happened. That's what made it land so differently than ordinary defensiveness. The courtroom didn't receive her response calmly. Multiple people gasped audibly. A woman near the back said clearly enough for the microphones to catch it, "That could have been my son." Even the court reporter's fingers paused momentarily over the keyboard. Judge Caprio asked her directly whether she understood the severity of travelling 80 miles per hour on a residential street where children lived, played and rode bikes home from school. She said she was an excellent driver, that she had never hit anyone, that if parents couldn't keep their children safe, that simply wasn't her problem. What do you think the appropriate response should be when someone says that in open court? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read them, and this is the kind of question worth actually discussing. Judge Caprio's expression changed, not to anger, not to the kind of outward frustration that would have given her something to push back against, something quieter than that, more deliberate. The warmth that typically characterized his interactions with defendants appeared to recede, replaced by a controlled, patient disappointment that somehow carried more weight than any raised voice could have managed. He told her he was looking at her record, 7 violations in 2 years. He asked what she made of that pattern. She said, "So, I paid for all those. Well, my dad paid. Same thing. That's just how it works, right? You get a ticket, you pay it, and it's done." She delivered this as if she were explaining a straightforward process to someone who was making it unnecessarily complicated, as if the entire purpose of the legal system was simply to collect money from people who could afford to pay it, with no further obligation on either side. Judge Caprio told her clearly that was not how it worked, that each violation represented a choice that endangered others, that those previous tickets were not completed transactions. They were warnings. Warnings she had walked away from each time without learning what they were trying to teach her. She told him she didn't have time for a lecture. She picked up her phone from the podium where it had been sitting, began scrolling, and told him he should just name the fine and she'd have her father's assistant send a check. That moment is one that I find genuinely hard to watch. even just reading about it. Not because it's dramatically outrageous, but because you can see exactly how this person was taught to relate to the world. Every system is a transaction. Every consequence is negotiable if you have enough money behind you. No one ever sat across from her and made that belief feel wrong, because every time it was tested, it worked. That's not entirely her fault, but it is entirely her problem now. Judge Caprio told her to put the phone down immediately. She finished typing, then she set it back on the podium, looked up and said, "There, done." Happy? The sarcasm was fully intact. So was the phone, still face up, still visible. The gallery was no longer quiet. A man in a veteran's cap said loudly, "Unbelievable! Absolutely unbelievable." A woman who appeared to be a teacher shook her head and said to her companion, "This is what we're dealing with now." The bailiff had moved closer to the podium, not because Madison was a physical threat, but because the atmosphere in the room had shifted into territory that required closer attention. Judge Caprio picked up a document and asked her whether she had told the officer at the time of the stop that her father would handle it and that the officer was wasting her time. She confirmed that she had and said she still didn't see what the big deal was. He told her calmly that the big deal was the assumption that who her father was could exempt her from laws that existed to protect everyone equally, including the 9-year-old on the bicycle. She responded by naming her father, describing his development portfolio, and telling Judge Caprio plainly that a speeding ticket was going to go away, just like every other problem always had. "It always does," she said, with complete confidence. And then Judge Caprio nodded to the court clerk, and the monitor on the courtroom wall came on. What appeared on that screen was Madison Pierce's own Instagram story, posted publicly 2 days earlier. She was behind the wheel of her car. Her face was clearly visible. She was holding her phone up toward herself while driving, and the speedometer was framed perfectly in the shot. It read 90 miles per hour. Her voice filled the courtroom through the speakers, bright and completely unaware of where those words were about to land. "Daddy's lawyers are better than your laws." A nail polish emoji sat at the bottom of the screen. Her face went white. She said it was a joke, that she had been exaggerating, that it wasn't what it looked like. The clerk advanced to the next image. It was a photograph Madison had posted outside this exact courthouse during a previous visit. She was posing with an exaggerated, pouty expression. The caption beneath it read, "Ugh, traffic court, adorable poor people trying to feel important." The room turned, not just uncomfortable, genuinely and openly angry. The man who had taken time off work to contest a fine he couldn't afford stood up part way, his face flushed. A woman said aloud, "She called us adorable poor people." The murmurs were gone now. People were speaking in full sentences. The third image on the screen was a screenshot of a text conversation between Madison and a friend. The friend had asked if she'd gotten another ticket. Madison's reply was clearly visible. "Laws are for poor people. My dad will make it go away, like always." Judge Caprio noted that she had posted all of this publicly to 47,000 followers, that there was no expectation of privacy when someone broadcast their contempt for the legal system openly to the world. Madison was no longer making eye contact with anyone. She was staring somewhere slightly to the left of the podium with the expression of someone who has just fully grasped for the first time that they have been building a case against themselves this entire time. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something. Everything that was happening to Madison Pierce in that moment, the public exposure, the gallery's anger, the judge's quiet disappointment, was constructed entirely from things she had chosen to do and say herself. Nothing had been fabricated or exaggerated by anyone in that room. The officer wrote down her exact words at the traffic stop. The social media posts were her own creation, posted voluntarily, left public. Every piece of evidence that was dismantling her position in that courtroom had come directly from her own choices. There is something almost instructive about that, even if the lesson arrives in an extremely uncomfortable way. Then something unexpected shifted the atmosphere entirely. A voice came from the back of the gallery. "Your Honour, if I may address the court." Richard Pierce stood slowly from his seat in the last row. He was a well-dressed man in his late 50s, and his face carried the particular weight of someone who had been watching something unfold and could no longer pretend he wasn't responsible for part of it. He walked forward with the measured composure of a man who had made a decision before he stood up. He told the judge that his daughter was young and had made serious mistakes. He said he took responsibility for not teaching her proper respect for the law or for other people. He asked whether he could pay whatever fine was appropriate and promised the court that this behaviour would not continue. I think Richard Pierce genuinely loved his daughter. I believe that without any hesitation. But love expressed as protection from every consequence isn't actually protecting the person. It's protecting a version of them that was never forced to grow. And I think somewhere in the back of that courtroom, watching that monitor display her own words back to her, he finally understood what he had actually built. Judge Caprio's response to Richard Pierce was direct but measured. He acknowledged that he understood loss, that he understood the instinct to protect a child, especially after losing a spouse and raising that child alone. But he told him plainly that what he had been doing for years wasn't protection. It was prevention. Preventing Madison from learning what mistakes cost. Preventing her from understanding that the law applied to her the same way it applied to everyone else in that room. He said Madison didn't need another check written on her behalf. She needed to understand that consequences were real and that they did not come with an opt-out clause for people with wealthy parents. Richard Pierce's eyes filled with tears. He said he knew, that he had known for a while, that every time he tried to hold firm, he thought about her mother, about losing her, and he couldn't bear the thought of his daughter being angry with him on top of everything else. He sat down slowly, and something in his posture had changed. The bearing of a man who had made a decision he should have made years earlier and was only now arriving at the moment to act on it. Madison, watching her father say those words in that room, made one last attempt to pull the situation back toward familiar territory. She told him not to listen, that they should call the lawyers, that they didn't have to sit here and accept this. She actually turned toward the courtroom doors and took a step in that direction, as if the hearing was something she could simply exit when it became inconvenient. The bailiff moved immediately to block the exit. Judge Caprio stood and told her with complete clarity that attempting to leave during an active hearing constituted contempt of court, and that if she did not return to her seat immediately, she would be placed in custody right then. His voice was quiet. It reached every corner of the room without effort. She stopped. She turned around, and then her legs seemed to lose some of their earlier certainty, and she sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking. The composed, unbothered person who had clicked across those marble floors an hour earlier was entirely gone. Judge Caprio stood and delivered the sentence methodically and completely. $1,000 for reckless driving, the maximum penalty allowed. $500 for expired registration. $2,500 for contempt of court based on her conduct throughout the hearing. $1,000 in associated court costs. $5,000 total, due immediately with no payment plan and no deferral. Her driver's license suspended for 6 months, effective immediately. Not reduced, not negotiated, not delayed. 80 hours of community service with the city's youth traffic safety program, where she would visit schools and speak to children about the dangers of speeding, using her own case as the example. Attendance at a victim impact panel, where she would hear directly from families who had lost someone to reckless driving. A 2,000-word written essay on why traffic laws exist, submitted to the court within 30 days. And the Instagram post mocking the court had to be removed and replaced with a public apology within 48 hours, or she would face an additional 30 days for contempt. Then he looked directly at Richard Pierce and told him the fines were to be paid from Madison's own money, not her father's accounts, not a family fund, her money. If she didn't have it, she could earn it. If payment wasn't received within 90 days, a warrant would be issued for her arrest. Richard Pierce looked at his daughter and said, "Madison, enough." He told her the judge was right, that he had failed her by removing every consequence before it could teach her anything, that starting from that day, things would be different. She would pay the fines herself. She would complete the service hours herself. And if she found that difficult, then perhaps that difficulty was exactly what she needed to finally understand what growing up actually required. That was the moment that visibly reached her. Not the suspension, not the $5,000. Her father saying enough out loud in public and meaning it. Judge Caprio's final words before the gavel came down were measured and direct. He told her she was 23 years old, young enough that this day could be a turning point rather than a defining characteristic. That 5 years from now, she could look back on this morning as the worst experience of her life, or as the moment that finally forced her to become someone different. The choice, he said clearly, belonged to her. The gavel fell. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, subscribe to this channel. Every week I bring you moments from courtrooms where the law reminds someone, sometimes gently and sometimes not, that accountability doesn't check your bank balance before it shows up at the door.